G'day everyone, welcome back to another video. So Formula One testing has just wrapped up. Notoriously difficult, of course, to read anything into testing. They're always telling us this, but we've got nothing else to talk about until Melbourne, so let's try to actually draw some conclusions and get a little bit of a feel for what we're likely to expect in the first part of the 2020 F1 season. So the first team that we're going to look at is Mercedes. I think they are probably in front at the moment. That seems to be the general consensus. 903 laps completed, which is the most of anyone over the 4 days of testing. Now, the interesting fact about Mercedes is that it's been a very un-Mercedes test series. Normally they just kind of plod around, they do their own thing, they don't make any headlines, they don't run any fast laps. And this season has been completely different. They haven't flown under the radar at all. They've been getting the headlines. They've been doing the headline lap times. They've had their I think the DAS system. I forget what it stands for. But they've been making all the headlines, which is very unusual for Mercedes over testing. So it makes me wonder whether or not they're potentially trying to mask a couple of issues that they could be having. I mean, they completed the most laps out of anyone, so even with a couple of little reliability niggles that they had, little engine problems, they still seem to be travelling fairly well. Of course, the DAS system is what everyone's talking about. This, if you haven't seen it, it's a system whereby the toe of the front tyres is actually adjusted by pulling the steering wheel forwards and backwards. And the interesting thing about that is that they almost had everything ready as soon as people spotted it. They obviously knew people were going to spot it. It's something that's highly visible from on-car cameras. They knew people were going to spot it, and they almost had this. Within hours of it being first spotted, they'd released a video all about it, talking about it. They want everyone to know about this system. It's fairly obvious, which makes me wonder whether or not it's a mask for something else, because they know it's highly visible and they haven't. They've been really in your face about it. So for anybody who hasn't seen it, it's basically a system where, like I say, they adjust the steering, they adjust the toe of the front wheels, and most of the time you set your toe in the pits. So normally they face the front edges of the tyres away from each other just slightly, and that actually helps on turn into the corner and a little bit of stability as well. It does come at a cost though. It comes at a tyre wear cost because the tyres aren't running straight along the road. It comes at a little bit of a top speed cost as well. So I would imagine that it's primarily a tyre saving measure. But like I say, I do wonder if there's something else at play here. I'm sort of reminded of back in the 70s where I think it was Colin Chapman. Every time his cars rolled out of the garage, the mechanics went to great lengths to cover the diff. They'd always have a towel over it, rag over it, something like this. And of course everybody started to focus on the diff. What's with that diff? They all wanted to have a look at it. And then of course it actually turned out that the diff was perfectly normal. They were just trying to distract attention away from another area of the car. So I wonder if this is a similar thing. They put in this highly visible thing, which most experts seem to say is only going to give marginal gains, to cover up something else. And I wonder if they're trying to lead some of their rivals down some sort of development dead end to try and copy this system when there's other things on that car worth noticing. And I should imagine that perhaps, and this is only a guess, but it's entirely possible that Mercedes have developed a car that is very, very nice to its tyres, and they want people to think that the DAS is the reason why. So everybody's going to go to great lengths to copy this system, even though it's only legal for this 1 year, that they're going to go to great lengths to copy this system, and that's actually not the silver bullet which is giving them their performance. So I just wonder if there's a bit of that, just given how much of a very un-Mercedes test season they've had. It's a little bit strange. So anyway, watch this space. We're only going to find out once they go racing. So the second team in the list actually completed only the fifth highest lap total for the test, 4 days of testing, 780 laps, and that's Red Bull. I think Red Bull have actually jumped Ferrari. I think that seems to be the general consensus around everywhere, that Red Bull is second in the pecking order now behind Mercedes. I'm hoping for the sake of the season and the sake of the interest in the season that they're actually really close to Mercedes. That's going to depend on obviously the Honda power plant, how that's come along. Um, I'm actually really surprised that this marriage of Honda and Red Bull seems to be working because Adrian Newey, I mean, always the problem with the McLaren thing was trying to fit the engine into that size zero concept that they were developing for the McLaren. And Adrian Newey's designs are notoriously tightly packaged. So I just wonder how much of Adrian Newey's design has to be compromised in order to give Honda the space they need to work, or whether indeed that's still a problem for them. But in any event, I think Red Bull are second. They've been quite quiet. They normally are. They haven't completed as many laps as you think a team like that would, but they were way down the order last year too. I think they were eighth or ninth in the laps completed last year, and they still managed to be third in the constructors. So while laps completed is an indicator, it's not always a definitive guide, and I would be surprised if Red Bull are anywhere else than second. I think they'll be solid. I think if Alex Albon can sort of step up and start, qualifying within a tenth or so of Verstappen, then they could really make a run at the constructors this year because, Bottas, as we know, is up and down and all over the shop. So, they could make a really consistent run at it, perhaps. So, anyway, brings us on to Ferrari, which is third in my opinion. Anyway, like Mercedes, it's been a very un-Ferrari test season. They normally grab the headlines, don't they? Normally everybody goes into Melbourne thinking that Ferrari is the fastest car, and then they get there and they're not. But this year they've just been talking themselves down. Binotto has just been consistently talking themselves down, and it's very strange. They've had their issues, but they are definitely hiding their pace. Like, they have done some very quick sectors, but always sort of back it off in the last sector or something. So they have been playing around a little bit with that, but people can see through that sort of thing. And the general consensus around seems to be that they are not as competitive as they were last year. Whether it's as big a disaster as they're making out in the media, I'm not sure. I don't think they're going to be that terrible, but I think they have slipped behind Red Bull, and I don't think they're going to bridge that gap until at the very earliest, the start of the European season. It appears that all the business that went on between them and the FIA with the legalities or lack thereof of their engine has really perhaps diverted their attention a little bit when they were building this car, because perhaps they didn't know what was going to be legal, what's not, and they've ended up with perhaps a little bit of a compromise there. That's only a guess. But as we've seen with Ferrari anyway, unless they've addressed their operational issues in the off season, and they haven't done for the last few years, so there's no reason to suggest they would now. Even if they do have the fastest car, they generally find a way to either lose or almost lose. So there are some real operational issues down there at Ferrari. I can't imagine that they've all been solved over the off season. So if they've got the third fastest car, they may even find themselves, you make strategic errors then, you may even find yourselves coming under threat from the cars behind in the midfield. Don't know how big that gap's going to be. So anyway, time will tell with that one as well, I suppose. So on to fourth place. And at the moment, I think that's reasonably clear that is Racing Point, who've made themselves a Mercedes clone. Caused a little bit of outrage amongst the paddock, not least of which coming from Haas, which is kind of ironic given their relationship with Ferrari was causing so much issue a few years ago. But anyway, Racing Point have done what they're allowed to do. They've taken the rules to the maximum. They've built themselves a car that is in every respect a Mercedes. It's very, very close, and seems to have very good performance. Now, the thing with Racing Point is that historically they haven't developed well over a season, and they tend to get out-developed by the likes of, Renault, McLaren, etc. And they tend to start very well. It's what Sauber used to do back in sort of the 90s and 2000s. They start really well, and then they just wouldn't develop throughout the season, and by Spa, they're sort of, towards the back. The only sort of saving grace for them perhaps this year is the fact that everyone's going to be focusing so hard on getting their 2021 car right, because of course you've got all those new regulations coming in, that perhaps they're not going to be working as hard on their 2020 cars and developing them as hard as they may otherwise do. So that could allow them to hang on a little bit longer, but I would not be surprised to see Perez qualify on the third row in Melbourne. Melbourne's always been a circuit that suited Mercedes. the Racing Point basically is a Mercedes. So if I wouldn't be surprised to see the two Mercs, Verstappen, the two Ferraris, and Perez sat there on the third row with probably Albon and perhaps Stroll just behind. So that's going to be interesting to see if they can actually keep it up. I think everyone sort of accepts they're going to be strong mid-season. If they can keep it up, that's going to be a pretty good season for them. So we'll see what happens there. All right, so moving back from there, I think McLaren are fifth at the moment. I think they will jump Racing Point to fourth as the season goes on. They've been sort of upbeat about their progress. The new car seems to be better in just about every area than the old one, and the old one was pretty good. So same driver lineup, nothing's really changed for them. So evolution rather than revolution at McLaren. They just seem to be tidying up a few little bits and pieces, and I think by the end of the season they will be best of the rest behind the big three. Renault comes next. So Renault, I guess as an Aussie, I'm kind of hoping they have a better year than last year. For Danny Rick's sake, but they've been really, really secretive, haven't they? They've come out with that black livery, which is clearly designed to hide some of the carbon pieces that they've got in photographs. They didn't launch their car. They just kind of had the drivers and stuff there. They've been really secretive about everything, which just makes me wonder, it's odd for a midfield team to be that secretive over stuff. So whether or not they're expecting a really tight battle in the midfield, or whether they've actually got a card up their sleeve and they're going to start bothering the top three, which I'd love to see. But, don't know. They have given nothing away. Absolutely nothing away. They're the one team that you look at and you say, they could be anywhere from third to eighth, and no one really knows because they've been so secretive with everything. So hopefully they're hiding something good. Hopefully, for Ricciardo's sake, they're hiding something good. So anyway, so that brings us on to sixth place, and I think that sixth place will probably be AlphaTauri, which is basically Toro Rosso renamed from last year. Again, they haven't had any changes on the driver front. This Red Bull Young Driver program really isn't pushing them through the way it used to, is it? But they've got Kvyat and Gasly, and I guess they're just going to keep doing what they do. They're one of the very few teams in Formula One whose ultimate goal isn't really to win. It's to feed Red Bull, feed the main team. So I can imagine that they're probably going to be sitting where they sit, about 7th place every year. So it's just the way it is. So I don't see it too much changing on their front, although a lot of people seem to really like their paint scheme, so that's something for what it's worth. Alright, so the next one is Alfa Romeo. I think very much like AlphaTauri, they really exist as a Ferrari junior team. They got Kimi there. I know this is Kimi's last year on his contract because he signed for 2 years with Alfa. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him move on at the end of the year. But Giovinazzi's put in some decent performances as well. And their car last year just seemed to be really, really circuit dependent. Some tracks are right up there, some they're at the back. Well, not right at the back because Williams are always there, but sort of down the back. They I don't think are going to produce any major surprises this year. I think we know exactly what we're going to get out of them, and they're just going to be sort of sitting there making Q2 sometimes. Maybe they'll make Q3 a couple of times if the track suits them and Raikkonen feels like it. But apart from that, they're pretty much serving their purpose. You can argue all you like about B teams. Fact is that they exist, and that's their job, to basically do research for Ferrari. So that's what they're doing. And that brings us to the bottom two. Now, some will be surprised to see Haas down this low, but there is just really... Over the off-season, there has been nothing come out of Haas which has given you reasons for hope, if you're a Haas fan. And there's just been, they've lost their major sponsor, which I predicted at the start of last year, actually, that sponsor deal was going to go tits up by mid-year. That Rich Energy thing was always weird, and no surprises, that's gone from the car this year. And so they haven't replaced it with another major sponsor, so they haven't got a major sponsor. They really haven't made any. They haven't announced anything. There's no optimism at all coming out of that team. And I just think that the whole debacle last year with Rich Energy really hurt them. They lost a lot of development time as well, chasing down what turned out to be a development blind alley. Because if you remember, they took the latest, most updated car and ran it side by side with the very car that they started the season with in Melbourne, and the Melbourne car was better. So all they'd done all year with all the millions of dollars development they poured into that car has made it worse. So realistically, while everybody else was developing during the season, they only started developing about mid-season or late mid-season. I think they were still running comparison cars by the time they got to the US, which is really late in the season. So they are way behind the 8 ball as far as development goes. I would not be surprised to see them put out whatever car they've got now, just put it out, run it for the year, and put all their effort into 2021, because they are so far behind in the development race under this rule set. There is just no point. There just isn't. So I wouldn't actually be surprised if Gene Haas starts to reevaluate his involvement in F1 if the results don't get a bit better, which is a shame, because we need the independent teams. We can't just have Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull driving around. And I kind of like following the fortunes of the small teams. I think it adds a bit of an extra dimension to the interest. Certainly did back in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, when there were so many little teams around. You could, if you got bored of talking about Senna and Mansell, you could go and see how those guys were going and follow their stories. And I think that the sport needs the independent teams, and I would hate to see them drop out. But they did actually complete the lowest amount of testing laps of anybody, with only 649. So it's not looking great. There's very few reasons for optimism coming out of Haas. And of course that leaves us with the 10th place team, which is going to be Williams again. I think that's pretty clear. They appear to be at least closer to everybody else this year, but they are still last. That seems to be the general consensus. At least they're making progress. They're another team that I would suggest will likely look to 2021 rather than pour any major development in this year. I don't think they've got the money to develop 2 cars concurrently, so I think they're just going to pour everything into getting 2021 right. So I think they're going to start at the back. I think they're going to finish at the back. Hopefully they're a little bit closer to the likes of Haas and perhaps AlphaTauri and Alfa Romeo to maybe bother them in some of the races, especially early on before everyone starts developing. It'd be great to see them qualify off the back row of the grid once or twice during the season. But I really think for them that is the best hope that they've got. There are reasons for this, and everyone talks about the various reasons why Williams have found themselves in the situation that they are in. I've actually got my own opinion for that, but I'm going to put that into another video when I get around to it. So that is essentially the way I see the grid lining up for Melbourne. It's looking very, very good for Mercedes, you'd have to say. We really don't know where. Everybody sort of accepts that they're at the top, don't they? But we don't know what the gap is. So hopefully the gap is nice and small between the first team and the second team, whoever that proves to be, and we wind up with a really good, interesting season. So that is all from me this time, and we'll be back with some more stuff a little bit later on, probably after the first race.